Lots of room. He's 40, like a rocket. Look at Ginty go. Breaks a tackle. He's 20. He's 10. He's touchdown.
Here's a long run. Oklahoma State gonna do it again, and guess who? Big O to the house.
Milroe gonna run it again. Got a lane. Kicked in the turbo. Milroe. Goodbye. Touchdown, Bama.
Pump fake. Cook. End zone. Caught. Touchdown. Luther Burden the third.
This is the CFF Sites Week 1 show. My name's Joe DeSalvo, and we are talking Week 1 college fantasy football. Week 1's in the books. Well, almost in the books. We still have Florida State, Boston College, Labor Day night. I'm recording this on Monday, so of course, that game has not yet taken place, but we just decided to do something a little different this year. We're going to do some reactionary shows as opposed to doing the shows before the week starts on a Thursday night. I felt it was just more valuable for you guys from a reaction standpoint to kind of get a glimpse of what I'm looking at, what we're looking at the CFF site as we come out of the weekends and sort of compare expectations to reality of what happened, what we were expecting to happen, and what we could be expecting in the future. Look, before I get started into recapping Week 1, let's just say the CFF site, all the projections have been live. We've got Week 2 that are going to be hitting this week, and it's never too late to become a member over at the CFF site. Of course, if you get an All-American or a Heisman membership, you get an invite to our Discord, which is valuable just in itself. And look, you don't even just have to be wired in to college fantasy football to see that Discord as a resource. We've got betting channels, DFS channels, you name it, we got it. Team-specific channels in there if you just like keeping up with your specific teams. We've got all the latest and greatest news. And look, that Discord is really made by the community. You guys help make what it is absolutely the best place to be for college fantasy football. If you play DFS, we've got all the latest and greatest. Mike's got his DFS write-ups every week. Did a fantastic job with that this past weekend. Of course, we've got the projections. We just posted this week's waiver wire as well. My notes and observations are up on the site as well. So just a lot of information. College fantasy football, that is who we are. That is what we do, and we love it. And so with that being said, let's get into Week 1 reaction, right? Like, we're not going to be able to touch on every single game because there were so many games on that slate throughout the week because of all the FBS, FCS matchups. But I feel sometimes it's just good to kind of pause and say, okay, where did we kind of get it right? Where do we get it wrong? Where do we need to pivot? Where do we need to hold? I think it's important to look at that as we go into Week 2, because the one thing that I do notice when I'm watching the games, and I try to watch as many games as I can, bits and pieces of it. I've analyzed all the box scores through the weekend. And so this is the show that comes out of all of that sort of initial analysis for me. And that is the one thing we cannot do after 1 week is overreact, right? Like, there's a lot of, oh, what do we do with this player? There's some obvious ones, but there are some other ones where you do have to hold. Look, there are some instances where some of these teams are playing FCS opponents, and why would they want to run some of their starters in the ground? We have a college football playoff, an expanded playoff this year. You're going to need your best players healthy into November, into December this year. So, and I'll talk about that as we get down the line with some of the players, but kind of have to hold tight. You get an extra week in college fantasy football this year. We get 14 weeks. Most teams have 2 bye weeks this year. So that's a little different than the last few years. So there's some adjustment that needs to come out of this. But the main thing that I would say is just, let's not overreact. Let's everyone take a deep breath. relax. Let's put week one under the microscope and go from there. So here we are. Let's just start off first of all with Central Florida hosting New Hampshire, right? Not a lot can be said about that matchup, but I do have a couple of points. And that I thought KJ Jefferson looked rather ordinary average in that matchup. They have another good matchup this week where I think he has a chance to get right. Sam Houston State. I think Sam Houston will be good enough, but not quite the quality of what UCF is going to be facing on a week-to-week basis. So I think it's a good matchup for KJ Jefferson to get right. And I think for those of, there were some concern about whether or not Penny Boone transferring in would affect the fantasy stock of RJ Harvey. I didn't see that in the first game. I think RJ Harvey could have as good a year as he had last year. Let's see how that plays out. Central Michigan, Central Connecticut State. I just think what's important here is that as long as Marion Lukes is out, Miles Bailey becomes a fantasy asset. We don't know when Lukes will be back, but Central Michigan does travel to FIU next week. Could be a really good spot start for Miles Bailey. Fordham at Bowling Green. Bowling Green hosted Fordham. I just think the one good thing to come out of that was that Harold Fannin kind of reassured his fantasy owners that he was going to be a top flight tight end in full FBS leagues this year, in that Terrion Stewart, running back for Bowling Green, would be a viable option this year, especially as the Falcons get into MAC play. North Carolina State, right? They beat Western Carolina. A little bit of a struggle there for NC State. But I think the one thing that stood out to me is just when you look at NC State assets, when you look at McCall, when you look at Concepcion, you look at Jolie, the tight end. I think the proven assets, the ones we were expecting to do well, off to a fast start at NC State. That's a good sign. Arkansas, 70-0 over Arkansas. Pine Bluff, a really good chance to get a glimpse of what Taylon Green can do in that offense. And I think more importantly, shows what we might be able to get from Jaquindon Jackson moving forward at Arkansas. But the most important part is he has to stay healthy in that offense. And that's always been his issue. That was it when he was out over at Utah. So let's see if Jackson can stay healthy. If so, I think he's going to have a good year in that Arkansas offense, especially seeing how they utilized him in that first game. Good tidbit from Toledo. I'm high on Juwan Newton this year, the wide receiver for Toledo. I think with Daquan Finn gone and Tucker Gleason there, I really think that Newton has a chance to hit double-figure touchdown receptions this year. Just a quick note on that one. Let's go over to UAB, where, a lot of, is it going to be Lee Beebe? Is it going to be Isaiah Jacobs when he's healthy? Well, we were on BB a little heavier. Sometimes you have to invest or put a little bit more stock in the player that is proven healthy, but I don't want to dismiss the fact that Jacobs is there, and Jacobs could be a fantasy factor as well for UAB. Look, UAB opened up with that matchup against Alcorn State. Lee Beebe had a couple of fumbles and still got 15 carries, 78 yards, and scored the team's 2 lone rushing touchdowns. So I think that really bodes well if you have Lee Beebe for UAB. Tulsa whooped up on Northwestern State, 62-28. I think the big news and nugget coming out of there, Kirk Francis, right? The freshman quarterback for Tulsa, 5 touchdown passes, 23 of 30. Looks like a viable fantasy option moving forward. Tulane, 52-0 over Southeastern. This is where kind of the rumblings start coming in. Mekhi Hughes, 14 carries, 59 yards, only 1 touchdown in that game. When you look at quarterback Ty Thompson, he had a couple of rushing touchdowns. Will it be Thompson? Will it be Mensah moving forward? Mensah had a couple of touchdowns throwing. Thompson played there at the end. I think when the game, was kind of getting out of hand. This is one I don't worry about. I think the coaching staff in their system has proven they're going to ride their running back 1, Tulane, 52-0 over Southeastern. Or is this a game really where they're going to need Hughes to carry the ball 20 to 25 times? If they did, I would say Tulane wasn't going to be as good as we thought they were. So I feel good with Hughes, even though 59 yards and a touchdown. I feel good about his fantasy prospects moving forward. Really, really high on him. Those were some of the early week matchups. And then like the big one, Colorado, North Dakota State, that was a big primetime matchup that we were watching. That game was a good game. And here's my observation for this. Colorado is going to be much of the same of what they were last year. They're not going to be able to run the ball well. They're going to throw it a lot. Shedeur Sanders is going to get his numbers. I made the comment, Travis Hunter, to me, looks to be a better wide receiver than defensive back. And the only reason I think I could say that right now is because we really don't see the ball thrown his way much when he's on defense. But man, that kid is so darn good. I mean, unbelievable. Some of the catches that he was making. And I have to say this, I think Sanders, I think that's going to be, look, I know he's not 6'4", but he's going to be the red zone target. With hands like that, Sanders is going to be looking for him in the red zone. I could see Hunter getting 12, 15 touchdown receptions this year. Now, here's the caveat, right? What if Colorado goes down that downwards, if they find themselves in that downward spiral that they were last year, which was the reason I stayed away from Colorado assets, Colorado picks, was that I didn't want any part of it if it got out of hand like it did last year. Because I have a feeling if it gets like that in year number 2, it could be worse than next year. Because we know that Sanders is gone, Hunter's gone, and will Primetime even be back next year? I don't know. They're just a portal hitting team. I can't really say there's a foundation on that roster. But if you have Shedeur Sanders, Jimmy Horn, Travis Hunter, you have to feel encouraged. I just worry about the long-term prospects. I'm curious to see how Colorado, how that situation is going to play out this year. But man, if you've got Travis Hunter, you have to feel really good. You got to steal on him because we certainly did not rank him as high as I think he's going to finish. There's quite possibly he could be a top 20, 25 receiver before this year's over with, if he sticks on the offensive side of the football. Let's look at Missouri. I think a situation that needs talking about is the running back situation. You had Marcus Carroll coming in from Georgia State, Nate Noel coming in to transfer from Appalachian State. We were leaning more with Carroll in our preseason rankings, a little bigger body, a guy that has proven that he could carry the ball 20 plus times week after week after week. And we know that's what Missouri can do in utilizing their running back. Heavy workload. Carroll seemed like his frame sort of fit that profile. But then you have Nate Noel too, right? And that offense and that system does really like and can maximize the potential of a running back that has dual threat ability. And Noel can not only carry the rock, but he can catch the ball out of the backfield. And that was the one thing that really jumped out to me early, was how Missouri really utilized him both ways. And I think for that reason, Nate Noel looks like he could be a really good fantasy asset this year. So that was the thing that really jumped out at me in regards to Missouri. North Carolina on the road at Minnesota, obviously with Max Johnson going down. That does kind of, I wasn't sure Max Johnson was going to win that job in the preseason with Harrell, kind of the way that, some of the tidbits that we had seen from him. But I think once we saw him get into the game, I think it was quite clear that Johnson was the better quarterback out of the two. And my concern, and the reason why I didn't rank Omarion Hampton as high as Mike did, was I was a little concerned that the quarterback spot was going to really, what it was going to do and affect Hampton. Now, I have to tell you, watching Hampton, he's a phenomenal talent. But when you look at the numbers too as well, 30 carries, 129 yards, 5 receptions, 17 yards receiving. PPR leagues, I mean, you've got that 129 and you've got that those 5 receptions. Those numbers are going to add up pretty quickly. But what scares me is whether or not North Carolina is going to be able to find the end zone enough. And that's what scared me from ranking as Marion Hampton as a top 5 running back. I just have concerns on whether or not North Carolina is going to be able to put up enough points. Now, I do think he's going to have some really big games because, quite honestly, he is the talent in that offense. They have to ride him. Hopefully, he holds up. But that would have been my concern with Marion Hampton going into the season. Utah, 49-0 over Southern Utah. And look, every year it becomes a broken record, right? Like the Utah running back situation. Is it going to be Micah Bernard? Is it going to be Jalen Glover? You know, we were leaning with Mike Mitchell. We were getting a lot of tidbits from him throughout preseason camp. He had 21 yards and a touchdown reception. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Deion Stanley comes out and just absolutely blows up, leads the team in rushing with 34 yards, leads the team in receptions, 3 catches, 150 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He had a 79-yard touchdown catch, averaged 50 yards in his 3 receptions, and now all of a sudden he's the talk of the town. And so I think he's one of those guys, those long shots, if you have a deep roster and you want to take a shot, he's a guy that you would add. Because I said this in the preseason show that Mike and I recorded, Utah is going to be very good. They are going to be contenders in the Big 12. And because they're going to be contenders, there's potential for a running back in that offense to have a really good year. But again, for me, the trend feels like with Utah, we're going to be really good. We can win the Big 12. We're going to be in the playoffs. They can rotate guys all season long. I mean, nobody got more than 6 carries this past week. Now, of course, they only played Southern Utah. Let's see how things unfold this week when they host Baylor. Better competition, I think, for teams like Utah. In situations like the Utah backfield, we're going to get a better feel of what Utah is going to be moving forward this week, as opposed to watching them against Southern Utah, where they start conference play in week 2. Just the encouraging thing to look, encouraging things out of that matchup. Cam Rising, Brant Keithy, the quarterback and tight end, back this year. Great start for both of those guys. San Jose State, I think just the running back situation is worth exploring. We knew Nick Nash would be the wide receiver 1 to have over there at San Jose State. A lot of talk with Floyd Chalk and Jabari Bates coming in. I have to tell you, I was following that game for a good bit. Chalk scored a couple of late touchdowns. And because of that, his numbers really distinguished him from Jabari Bates. And so I have concerns about San Jose State moving forward. Look, they were playing Sacramento State and were really getting challenged late in that game. Kind of curious to see how competitive San Jose State will be. I'm just not overly confident in that running game and whether or not Chalk is going to be a consistent fantasy running back for you guys that actually have him. Michigan State, Florida Atlantic. I just think the big thing to note out of that matchup is you've got Kayron Adams and Nate Carter. Again, Michigan State, I cannot, they are going to really, in my opinion, unless one of those guys gets sidelined with some sort of an injury or is going to miss a little time, I don't know how you choose out of both of those guys. And again, let's draw a comparison to the North Carolina situation. Aiden Childs came in with a lot of fanfare, a lot of hype coming over with his coach from Oregon State, really unproven. Wasn't really on the Aiden Childs hype train. I'm still not. But he probably just needs some experience. But this is year 1 for Michigan State. I just don't see Aiden Childs being any good this year. For one, make him to make him a fantasy asset, and 2, Carter and Adams are really just kind of neutralizing each other's fantasy stock. So for me, that's going to be a pass situation. Oklahoma put up 51 points on Temple. Look, Deion Burks, obviously the standout there. 6 catches. He only averaged 6 yards a catch, but 3 of them went for touchdowns. Jackson Arnold, I think he's going to be really good in the SEC. I said that at the beginning of the year in one of our shows. If you go back and listened to our quarterback show, really was high on Jackson Arnold in the SEC. The one thing that I'm kind of, a little kicking myself over right now, we'll see. I don't want to react. I'm telling you guys not to overreact, so I'm not going to try to overreact as well. And I wasn't very high on Gavin Sawchuk in the preseason. I felt that Javante Barnes and there was going to be some heavy rotation in Seth Luttrell's system. I could be wrong. This was a 51-3 game against Temple. A lot of rotation there. But my fear long-term is Sawchuk is not going to be the fantasy stud that I think many thought he would be. And I could see Oklahoma rotating some guys through there. Curious to see how that running back situation shakes out. Wisconsin. I want to talk about this because, look, a lot of what we're getting into are a lot of things that I wanted to touch on leading up to week one. So some of these I'm revisiting coming out of week one. And that was, I have a lot of shares of Tawee Walker at Wisconsin because I'm not confident that Ches Melisi can hold up over the course of the season. He has not been able to do that. And so I think grabbing Tawee Walker was very smart because there is a chance that he could get the backfield by himself if Melisi doesn't hold up once again. Through 1 week, split backfield, which, you know what? I'm fine because some of the shares that I have in best ball with Tawee Walker, 66 yards and a touchdown, 2 receptions every once in a while is going to be good enough for a best ball lineup. I took him because I felt that there's a chance long-term that he could establish himself as running back. We'll see how that shakes out. Stanford, a couple of things that really stood out in that matchup. Ashton Daniels, quarterback. There were higher hopes that he'd have a better statistical season or a much better statistical season this year than last year. But looks like Justin Lamson is still a thing in certain packages. And I think for TCU, the one thing that just really stood out was that Savion Williams just had so many targets. Matter of fact, Savion Williams, Jack Bech, and J.P. Richardson really all the target share in that offense. Heavy target volume. Encouraging for any 3 of those, but particularly Savion Williams. Louisville, real quick, 62-0 over Austin Peay. I think just rubber stamped that Ja'Corey Brooks is going to be Tyler Shugg's wide receiver 1. Vanderbilt on the road. Vanderbilt beats Virginia Tech 34-27 at home in overtime in a game Vanderbilt was winning 17-0. Again, going back to one of my gut feelings, I thought Virginia Tech was one of those teams going into 2023, going into last year, where they were relatively unknown, new coach, new systems, and no one was really quite sure how that was going to shake out. Drones ended up being the quarterback. The Virginia Tech offense took off. Tootin and Drones were a very good 1-2 punch down the year, even through the bowl game that was played in the rain. They had those big games. I felt Virginia Tech was a team that could have a year 2 letdown because I just feel like that coaching staff is still, I'm not sold on them, and I could be wrong. With that said, Virginia Tech still, when you look at Virginia Tech fantasy resources as far as Drones and Tootin, not a bad statistical performance, especially considering how the Hokies started. Tootin only had 34 yards rushing, but he did have a touchdown, and he did have 6 receptions and a touchdown. So they get Marshall this week, right? I'm not sure, Marshall's not going to be as good as Vanderbilt. Chance for Virginia Tech to kind of get right again. So we'll see how that plays out for the Hokies. Iowa. Let's go to Iowa. I made a comment in the CFF site Discord. Iowa is doing Iowa things. It was 6-0 against Southern Illinois at halftime. 2 field goals, no points allowed. That's Iowa being Iowa. And then all of a sudden they ended up on 40 points. So how much of it was window dressing, we'll see. But the one thing that really stood out, Kamari Mouton got the start at Iowa, the running back, which I have some shares of him or at least one in a deep best ball league that I'm in, because through some of the things I was reading throughout spring, throughout summer, throughout fall, I felt there was a chance that he could take over as a starter before the year ended. He had 19 carries for 65 yards in that game against Southern Illinois. The thing that's interesting, though, other than LaShawn Williams really seems like he's a non-factor as a top 2 back, Caleb Johnson finished with 119 yards and 2 touchdowns on 11 carries. Now, a lot of that came at the end of the game, but it was so impressive that you wonder now if Johnson will kind of cut into that Moulton volume, and wonder if you see a little bit of a split backfield there. So let's see how things shake out. Look, Iowa plays Iowa State coming up this week. Expecting a low scoring game there. So let's see how the carries shake out for Iowa in this matchup. Georgia 34-3 over Clemson. A couple of observations from this game. One, obviously, Trevor Etienne not there, right? Nate Frazier was the standout in the offensive backfield. The only thing I kept thinking to myself was, man, I drafted some shares of Ben Yurosek, Oscar Delp, not knowing which one was going to be the starting tight end. And if you look at the box score or you watch the game, Lawson Lucky was the only tight end that caught a pass. And so now I wonder, I may have drafted 2 tight ends throughout the course from Georgia, hoping that one hits. I may have not even had the right one, even though I went with both Yurosek and Delp. Let's see how that tight end situation shakes out at Georgia. But Lawson Lucky looks like, to me, he's the tight end 1. We'll see how that plays out. And you have to wonder if Frazier's kind of worked himself up to just be running back 2. On the Clemson side, you know what? A lot of reaction in the Discord about, hey, this Clemson looks cooked. I'd say let's take a deep breath. Clemson played Georgia. It is Georgia. Let's see how Clemson fares next week against Appalachian State, and then I think we can go ahead and make some decisions from there. Tennessee 69-3. I think the one thing with Tennessee, my observation for that is, I feel like Tennessee's going to spread the ball around a bit at wide receiver. I think it could be a different wide receiver every week. I think collectively as a group, they are going to be better fantasy assets than they were a year ago. But other than quarterback, I think the one player I want to have on Tennessee is Dylan Sampson, running back. I think he's going to have an absolute big statistical season for Tennessee. Ollie Gordon II doing Ollie Gordon things at Oklahoma State in week 1. In Cincinnati, great start to Brennan Sorsby, who that was one of my sleeper quarterbacks in the preseason. The only disappointing part to the opener, Corey Kiner, 7 carries for 51 yards. Let's see if Kiner, remember, Kiner was a 1,000-yard back last year. Cincinnati has their entire offensive line returning. That run game should be the backbone, or the offensive line is going to be a strength to that offense. And let's see if Kiner can do the back-to-back 1,000-yard season. Again, Cincinnati played Towson, not really what they need Kiner for. Was this a game in which they were just trying to get a lot of guys looks? We'll see, but you have to hold your Kiner shares. Washington State 70-30 over Portland State. And I just think that, look, there's 2 things that come out of this matchup for me. One, had we known John Mateer was going to stick as the starter, Mateer probably would have been a top 10 fantasy quarterback because of Washington State's system and because of the schedule. But because we couldn't make that call, that quarterback race wasn't settled all the way up to the start of the season. And who knows, maybe Eckhouse still gets his shot, right? But through 1 week, Mateer seems like he's rubber stamped himself as the starter. The one big thing that came out of this as far as a miss so far is that we were getting a lot of reports in the spring, in the summer, in preseason camp about wide receiver Josh Meredith in the slot. Now, again, it was only 1 game, and a game that Washington State ran away with pretty quickly. But I am worried about whether or not the tidbits that came out about Meredith, whether or not we were getting bamboozled because we didn't see him do anything in week one. He didn't have a catch. I think he may have had 2 targets. He didn't have a catch. That's the one that I'm really worried about because we were really high on Meredith. Let's see how that plays out, because here's the situation with Meredith. When you look at the week 2 matchup, Washington State's got Texas Tech. Absolute golden matchup. If you have a Texas Tech or Washington State player, you have to start him this week. But because Meredith didn't have a catch in the first game and only 2 targets, this is the matchup where you want to play him. And I don't know if you can. I'm not sure that I'm sure a lot of fantasy owners are going to balk about putting Meredith into their lineup, considering he didn't have a catch this past week. And yet the transfer that came in, Chris Hudson from Oregon, and then Kyle Williams, had a big year last year in that offense, were standouts in week 1. And those 2 guys, you obviously are going to be rolling with this week. As we look, Indiana, let's go to Indiana FIU. The one thing that really, really stood out to me with Indiana was 40 rush attempts with 25 pass attempts. Now, I get it. They manhandled FIU pretty good. We talked about how easy Indiana's start of the season schedule was, but I was more hopeful that Curtis Rourke would have better numbers in this matchup, in that week 1 matchup. They get Western Illinois in week 2. Let's see if they open up the offense a little more, or are they going to rely on the running game again? And for me, a complete surprise was seeing Elijah Surratt. Remember, he had that monster year at James Madison, came over with the coach to Indiana, only 2 catches for 12 yards. I think he was like 4th or 5th best on a team for targets in week 1. That's the thing that really stood out to me. And now if you have Elijah Surratt, he's a guy that I could see some people, he's a guy I could see being expendable if you see a waiver wire gem out there, which there are a ton. After that 1 week performance, I wasn't too hopeful. We'll see if things turn around in week 2, but I don't want to overreact, but that's one I was not feeling too encouraged by. Nebraska over UTEP. I think the one thing that stood out to me watching a little bit of the game, Isaiah Nair seems to be Dylan Raiola's go-to wide receiver. Jamal Banks, I still think, is going to be a viable option in that offense, but Nair, to me, really was the one that stood out. Iowa State, to me, that's a struggle. 21-3 against North Dakota. And Abu Sama III led the team in rushing for 36 yards. He only had 5 attempts. That's one I'm just concerned about. They get Iowa coming up this week. You have to wonder, well, is he? I can't see where anybody's really going to start him this week. Then they have a bye in 2 weeks before they get Arkansas State, Houston, Baylor, and West Virginia. So you are possibly now, all you Abu Sama owners who went in on him, possibly looking at 3 weeks with no production because they get Iowa. He didn't do anything this week. He gets Iowa. He didn't do anything last week. He gets Iowa this week, and he gets a bye the following week. Syracuse, Ohio, tons of nuggets from this game. One, let's just start with Ohio. Anthony Tyrus, 203 yards rushing, 2 touchdowns, a Northwestern transfer. Looks like he's going to stick as the running back 1 over Ricky Hunt. And the other thing that stood out to me was that Coleman Owen, tons of targets at receiver in that Ohio offense. Now, they were playing from behind most of that game. And I think there's 2 things that you have to feel good about with Syracuse. One, new coach, new system. They look pretty good. And I think if you have Oronde Gadsden, you have to feel really confident that he's back 100% from his injury. That was a concern of mine. Him coming back from that injury, that Liz Frank injury, and that there was new coaches, new system was a concern for me. But even Trevor Pena seems like he will be somewhat of a fantasy option in that offense. 3 total touchdowns, 1 rushing, 2 passing. put him on your watch list if you haven't had a chance to kind of do that thing with the waiver wire. He could be a player that could be viable. Miami at Florida. Quick observation there. I'm worried if I'm Florida, if I have Florida assets. I just don't think the Gators are that good. I'm not taking credit away from Miami. Miami's better than Florida. I just don't see Florida doing much this year. Man, they just did not look sharp not even close to sharp on offense. The thing that stood out to me from a Miami standpoint was Mark Fletcher Jr. had 2 rushing touchdowns. Damian Martinez didn't have one. And Fletcher even had one from 1 yard out, scored from 1 yard out. And now I'm wondering, is Fletcher going to be that short yardage back in that offense? And if so, that's going to take away from Damian Martinez's fantasy value. Texas 52-0 over Colorado. Feel good with Isaiah Bond. I think you have to feel good. Look, I think we whiffed a little bit on wide receiver 2 at Texas. We were kind of getting mixed signals on who that was. I think it's Matthew Golden. Matthew Golden had the second best game against Colorado State. That was a decent opponent that got out of hand quickly. But I'd kind of put Matthew Golden up there on that watch list if you don't have him, because I think he's going to end up being Texas's second best receiver from a numbers standpoint. Now, I know there was a lot of concern about Jadon Blue in the Texas backfield. 11 carries, 57 yards. Look, he did have 3 catches for 37 yards. Here's what I would say. Texas has extended the position. We know that C.J. Baxter was hurt. We know they suffered another injury in the backfield. Texas is going to be a team they're going to be a team that will most likely be in the college football playoff. They're going to need a stable of running backs at the end of the year. They're going to need Jadon Blue healthy, for one. But they need to know who they have behind Jadon Blue. In this game, when it's 52-0 or when it was out of hand, you've got to run the other running backs in there, because when Texas gets in the SEC play, I think that's the value of having Jadon Blue. Now, we'll see what happens this week, because Texas has to travel to Michigan. Not a favorable matchup for either team. And I don't see a ton of offense in that game. But you would expect that Texas is going to try to get Jadon Blue as many touches as they can, both on the ground and out of the backfield. And I think you owners will feel better about him, maybe not from a number standpoint by the end of the game this week, but from a utilization standpoint in bigger matchups, what Texas is going to do utilizing Jadon Blue. Ohio State, real quick. Man, I don't know if I'd love any one particular player in that Ohio State offense right now. They have another easy matchup this week against Western Michigan. I think it's just going to give them a chance to spread the ball around. I mean, look, I mean, Jeremiah Smith's going to be an absolute stud. Emeka Egbuka should have had a walk-in touchdown, but the defensive back tackled him at the goal line before the ball could arrive. I think there's just going to be a bunch of players that are going to get solid numbers, and I worry about whether or not there's just going to be one absolute fantasy stud on a week-to-week basis. That's my observation with Ohio State, at least through some of these cupcake matches. And like I said, they get Western Michigan this week. Boise State, Georgia Southern. I mean, look, Ashton Jeanty, the reason we love college fantasy football is for the hope that our guys are going to put up six touchdowns, and that's exactly what he did. So hats off to him. A little further down the line, I'll mention 2 games at one time, just because Liberty and South Florida, we had Kaden Salter and Byron Brown as our top 2 quarterbacks in the preseason, both ho-hum week 1, but matchups they didn't necessarily need those guys. Bigger days are ahead, so I wouldn't be worried if you have either of those guys. Blake Shapen at Mississippi State, quarterback, big week 1, made a comment in my notes and observations. I can see where you guys in 2 quarterback leagues could maybe utilize Blake Shapen over maybe 2 of the next 3 weeks moving forward based on that Mississippi State matchup. Oregon State, I mentioned when we talked about Michigan State, coaching staff at Oregon State last year goes to Michigan State. What's left? What's in the cupboard at Oregon State? Well, one, we know they're going to play a Mountain West schedule, right? So that's an encouraging thing. The other thing is that you've got Jam Griffin and Anthony Hankerson, and let's be honest, they combined for 44 carries, right? And so both of them combined for 44 carries, 315 yards, and four touchdowns. And the numbers literally mirror one another. I can see both of those guys, based on the Oregon State schedule, being a fantasy option down the line. And, I hate to say this, but sometimes injuries can really turn a fantasy asset into a fantasy star. And if one of those guys emerge as the guy, the go-to back, or that other guy sustains an injury and the other comes the number one guy by default, I think you've got value at an Oregon State running back one for future weeks. That matchup was against Idaho State, but remember, they are playing a Mountain West conference heavy schedule. Okay. Memphis 40-0 over North Alabama. Little concerned by some, I think, about Mario Anderson and his high ranking, but look, he had 2 touchdowns, and Sutton Smith seems to be on an injury report this week, so I don't think there's a lot to worry about. I do like me some Mario Anderson. Sam Houston State, the one nugget that really stood out to me was that wide receiver Noah Smith. He had 101 targets last year, only targeted twice in the week 1 matchup. That's a little concerning if you have him. Let's see what happens when Sam Houston State travels to Rice this week. One of the bigger storylines for me from a fantasy standpoint, UNLV 27, Houston 7. And I do have a lot of shares of Parker Jenkins this year. That one concerns me. I looked at that. I watched a little bit of that matchup, and that one was really, really tough to watch. I'm wondering if Donovan Smith, part of me feels that he is not going to stick as the starting quarterback. I think Willie Fritz may have a bigger challenge ahead of him in retooling, recalibrating that Houston program than what we thought he would. He is a program builder, though. He will get it right. But, man, I have to tell you, I'm really concerned about my Parker Jenkins shares after week 1. Let's see what happens. I didn't even see who Houston has coming up. They travel to Oklahoma this week before they get Rice, then at Cincinnati, then Iowa State, at TCU. Man. I'm worried about Houston. If you have Parker Jenkins in season-long redraft leagues, be curious to see what happens this week. I can see where he's kind of hit. I can see where people may be willing to cut bait on this Houston offense after week 2. Let's see. I'm going to stay optimistic, but I didn't sound optimistic, so I get it. Kansas State. Let's talk about DJ Giddens, right? I heard some people, what Dylan Edwards cutting into his fantasy production. Well, no, DJ Giddens had 124 yards rushing. They played Tennessee Martin, I'm sorry. They won 41-6. Let's see what happens this week. Kansas State goes to Tulane. And I think you DJ Giddens owners, you're just fine. Sitting pretty. Ole Miss playing Furman. I think the one thing that stood out to me is that we really are not finding out anything of this Ole Miss backfield because that matchup really didn't tell us anything. I'm not sure we're going to really learn anything this week when Ole Miss plays Middle Tennessee. I think the one thing that's going to happen now is that the more questions we have, the more answers I think we get. And that is, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't even worry about a running back at Ole Miss. Maybe when they're just around the goal line, they're going to feed Jackson Dart to try to up his touchdown total to get his Heisman numbers looking good. That's the only thing that I think of when I thought about Ole Miss and kind of looking and analyzing that box score. Alabama 63-0 over Western Kentucky. Seems like Alabama's going to be A-okay. Jalen Milroe, wow. I think he's going to have a better statistical year this year than he did last year. Kalen DeBoer hanging a 60 burger in his Alabama debut, just what he needed. And Ryan Williams, the sensational freshman receiver, again, like Jeremiah Smith over at Ohio State, showing that he's going to be a stud. He's going to be a stud. 52-51 Texas Tech over Abilene Christian. And this is why I said, look, Texas Tech, Washington State starters, start them all this week. Good start for Behren Morton. I think if you have him, you have to feel really good. Josh Kelly as well. You have to feel good about your stocks of him. The one thing that we were getting, there was a lot of hype about the freshman Micah Hudson coming in. Barely played, did get some snaps, didn't get a target. Redraft leagues. That might be a player you're probably already moving on. That might be a player they use more as the season goes, but looks like he may not be an option early on in the season. Auburn 73-3 over Alabama A&M. The one thing that stands out for me about Auburn is if you go look at those stats, you watch those numbers, you watch those plays, 3 of the top 4 receivers in there from that game last week were all super freshmen. That Auburn wide receiver room is absolutely stacked. Michigan 30-10 over Fresno State. 2 words, Donovan Edwards. All the attention is on the quarterback position. I don't really give a crap about the quarterback position from a fantasy football standpoint. I want to know what's going on at running back. Michigan plays Texas this week. Let's see if Donovan Edwards gets a little bit more run. Here's the thing I'm worried about Donovan Edwards, and that was when Blake Corum was there. He kind of played second fiddle, right? Well, in this matchup against Fresno State, Khalil Mullings, 15 carries, 92 yards. Donovan Edwards had 11 carries, 27 yards. He also had 2 catches. Is Edwards still kind of relegated to the role that he was in before? Because here's the thing that's interesting. I think we all would agree that when we look back, Blake Corum was the better of the 2 backs. Now, Edwards was always seemed to be the more talented, more hyped running back. But whenever Corum went down and Edwards got the show to himself, he was friggin' productive. And so I'm just wondering why we don't see Edwards with the touches why his touches were limited in a game where we really could have seen and probably could have, used his in a game that, his fantasy owners, let's see that playmaking ability, use him. Every time he's gotten a heavy workload, he's gotten better as the game has gone on. My concern is that he's just relegated to the role when Blake Corum was there. Now, I don't think he will be relegated to that role to that degree. But 11 carries when Mullings had 15 for me is very concerning. I'm curious to see what that Michigan offense can do, and I'm not too optimistic that they're going to be able to do much against Texas. Lincoln Riley, I think you're fine with him. Notre Dame at Texas A&M. I love the Notre Dame schedule. I love, I'm not Lincoln Riley, Riley Leonard. I love that Notre Dame schedule. To me, this was probably the toughest matchup on the schedule until maybe later in the year. I think Riley Leonard is going to be a great asset for you. Oregon, 24-14 against Idaho. This was a game that I have to say I wasn't watching, but I was following, and I couldn't believe I want to say going into the fourth quarter, Oregon's up 14-7 over Idaho, and I was like, is it raining sideways there? I wasn't watching the game. And I'm checking the box scores, and I see Tez Johnson, the usual, Jordan James, usual numbers, Dylan Gabriel, 380 yards passing. There just wasn't many points on the board. The only thing that you got to keep an eye on, I think, is you Evan Stewart owners. 3 catches, 15 yards. That's the one that does concern me. Let's see. Texas, I think San Diego State, Texas A&M Commerce. I just want to bring that one up because we know that Marquez Cooper transferred to San Diego State. Yes, it was Texas A&M Commerce, but Marquez Cooper getting 30 total touches, 27 rush attempts for 223 yards, and another 3 catches shows that he's going to be utilized pretty heavily in that San Diego State offense. SMU, I just think we're going to get much like we saw last year. It's going to be spread around. I think the one thing that we could take away, even though there seems to be, I thought Preston Stone, we might be okay. Is he okay? Not exactly sure. The one thing that seems tried and true right now is Brashard Smith being their running back one. I think he's the best asset on SMU right now, aside from RJ Maryland, who had that great opener against Nevada. And then I think he only had one catch last week. So give me some Brashard Smith. Utah State, 36-14 against Robert Morris. I think the one thing that came out of this matchup for me is that it seems like Kyrese White is going to be that complimentary receiver to Jalen Royals. Remember that Utah State system produces two good fantasy receivers usually. And if week one was any indication, Kyrese White will be that second receiver with Jalen Royals. Georgia Tech. I think the one thing that stands out at me from Georgia Tech is that Malik Rutherford, to me, seems like the best receiving option in that offense in the preseason. I think Eric Singleton was up there, but I think it's going to be Rutherford, right? Jamal Haynes, 3 touchdowns, 2 weeks. You have to feel really good about his fantasy potential moving forward. He was one of those probably fringe guys you've drafted really late, but looks like he's going to be a consistent option in that Georgia Tech offense. We start getting into a couple of the late games left, and then we're done. And just Arizona playing host to New Mexico, right? There was a lot of concern about, is Tet McMillan injured? Is he going to be okay? Is he fully healthy? Is he full go? 10 catches, 304 yards, and 4 touchdowns. I think he answered that bell pretty easily. Posted big numbers. Washington, obviously Weber State, but again, when you look at Will Rogers, only 1 touchdown pass. Washington still looked good. Damon Williams, the freshman quarterback, who I have to say, look, Rogers was 20-26 touchdown. The freshman quarterback, Damon Williams for Washington, if Washington, in my opinion, struggles as they get into Big Ten play, as they get into the meat of their Big Ten schedule, I would not be surprised to see Damon Williams become the starter on a week-to-week basis and take over that Washington offense. But the other thing that stood out to me as well, Denzel Boston, 6 catches, 76 yards, and a touchdown against Weber State. And we were high on Denzel Boston in the beginning of the year. But Giles Jackson, 10 catches, 98 yards, where there was some thought that could it have been Jeremiah Hunter that was going to be that wide receiver too. Looks like it's going to be Giles Jackson, Denzel Boston as the 2 top receivers in that offense. And then last night's game, USC, LSU, what a game to have on a Sunday night. The only football game on that really mattered yesterday, and we got a treat. Couple of observations. Nussmeier, I think, is going to be really good for LSU. I think his numbers are going to be really good. I can see 302 touchdowns pretty as a staple for him. He doesn't have the running ability that Jaden Daniels had. I don't really see his fantasy numbers getting anywhere close to where Jaden Daniels would have been. Kyron Lacey, to me, was just the best player on the field. They didn't get him the ball in the second half. He was really, to me, just the best fantasy standout on the field. On the USC side, Miller Moss, I think, more than answered the bell. There were some questions and concerns on whether or not Miller Moss would be USC's quarterback. This win in week 1 has gotten him a lot of credibility. I think it's going to take him a long way in USC, in him maintaining that starting job. Because remember, the transfer came in from UNLV, and there was a lot of steam on whether or not Miller Moss would stick as USC's quarterback. 378 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions against LSU, and a win, come from behind win. Great start for him. Again, the USC, the receivers, they're going to spread it around. I was encouraged. I've been high on Jacoby Lane. I think he's going to continue to be the best red zone target in that offense for them. But, man, you have to feel good if you've drafted Miller Moss, because the one thing that I do know is as we were getting into the heart of draft season, Miller Moss's draft stock dropped so much that you could get him in the 12th, 10, 12, 14 round range in some drafts. And if he plays the way that he played last night, even though he only had 1 touchdown pass, he'll get some more touchdowns. You may have gotten a nice steal later on in the draft, this draft season with Miller Moss, because he is a Lincoln Riley quarterback. So that brings us through week one. That's the reaction for me. Again, hold your horses, crew. Everybody take a deep breath. There's a lot to take in. Week one, there are so many games. Week two, there are a lot of games. And really, when you get into week three, I think that's when we're going to really start seeing the dust settle. You can start getting into a little bit more conference play. We're going to go into those last non-conference games. The matchups are going to be a little more competitive, and you're going to see your players really rise to the top, or you're going to be cutting them and moving on. And we're going to move on from this week one show. So that's it. That's a wrap up of week one. Time to get into week two projections. I've already started. We're heavy into it. Mike's got all the, I've got all the data to get in there. A lot of adjustments to make, a lot of depth chart changes. Mike's going to be putting the matchups underneath the microscope for his DFS write-ups this week. If you're not a member of the CFF site, it's not too late. Get on in. Get an All-American Heisman membership. Get all access to all the projections to help you make your decisions, whether you're playing college fantasy football, whether you're doing DFS. Get into the Discord. We've got the prop channels, general discussion channels, game day channels, DFS channels, betting channels. We've got it all. Your one-stop shop for college fantasy football is the CFF site. And that's going to do it for the week one show. My name's Joe DeSalvo for the CFF site, or the voice of the CFF site. See you guys in week two.